February 12th, 2009, Thursday. A Q400 is on approach into Buffalo. The crew's tired. First officer's been awake since the day before, and somewhere in that cockpit, something goes wrong that should never, ever happen. A stall, and the wrong response to it. 49 people on that plane never made it home, and one person on the ground who died in the house that the airplane hit. Out of that wreckage came a bunch of regulational changes. Out of those changes, a training program. And out of that training program came today's episode. This is BTC episode 90 of the Student Pilot Cast, a tragic past changing the pilots, or ATP-CTP.
Chandler Tower, Cherokee 4121 Tango, so Chandler Air Service. We have Zulu, and we'd like a south departure, please.
What does it take to be an angel? Where does the sun go when it sleeps? I should find out it isn't.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Student Pilot Cast. I'm Bill, and this is Beyond the Checkride. Here at the Student Pilot Cast, we fly and we learn, and we occasionally get a little nerdy about the regulatory history of aviation training programs. We got our buddy Kent back for another Beyond the Checkride, and if you've been listening a while, you know Kent is one of those guys who just kind of lives and breathes this stuff. He's like my aviation nerd mentor. We could talk airplanes for 6 hours and neither one of us would even notice. Anyway, he's been on quite a journey this past year, going from where a lot of us are right now to sitting in the right seat of a business jet. And before he could do any of that, he had to go through something called the ATP Certification Training Program, the ATP-CTP. And here's what I want you to understand before we get into it. That program exists because of a crash, a completely preventable crash. Some 50 people died, and the aviation world looked at itself in the mirror and said, we have to do better. The ATP-CTP is part of what came out of trying to do better, at least what it looks like on paper. And today, Kent's going to tell us what it looks like in real life. So whether you got 10 hours or 1,300 hours, this one's for you. Welcome back, Kent. After our little holding pattern, we're back again, and I'm excited to be back in the cockpit with you talking again where we happen to record it. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, and I'm laughing because you said we're going to be a little nerdy. We're going to go full nerdy on this one, as we usually do. But that's the best part of aviation is there's always new stuff to learn, right? And
totally.
Sadly, it wasn't really that aviation looked at ourselves and said we need to do better. Congress looked at us after Colgan 3407 and said, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. And yeah, that Colgan 3407 crash led to both the ATP-CTP rule and the 1,500-hour rule that so many people are not enjoying these days, let's say.
Lamenting. Yes.
Yeah, but you know what? That 1,500-hour rule moved the bar enough on just the amount of effort and money it takes for entry into the industry that it completely changed compensation in the industry. Mm-hmm. When I first got my commercial pilot certificate, the entry into the airline world was you go fly a Beech 1900 for Great Lakes Airlines for $19 an hour. And that's a flight hour. And you're limited to 1,000 of those in a year. So obviously the money was awful. And pilots were delivering pizzas on the side when they were at home and such. And that's not, we want the best people in the seat. And even though that means that you may have to slog it out in the right seat of a 172 bopping around the pattern a little more. Or there's a lot of other ways to get to 1,500 hours. I'm not even a CFI. So lots of ways to skin that cat. But because of that, it really changed the face of the compensation in the industry. And so that's why when you make it to the right seat at Envoy now, you actually make pretty good money. Instead of the poverty wages that used to happen. It increased safety, but it made the industry better in other ways too.
Yeah, those wages when I was a young buck is one of the things that dissuaded me from a career I thought I would really love, being an airline pilot. But I was in my early 20s and going, man, there's a lot of other ways to make money that seems like a long slog. So there's probably a lot more people like me who would have loved it and maybe even been a little bit good at it, but that kind of dissuaded us. So now we see kind of an influx.
A lot of us recovering IT professionals in the industry now.
That is true. That is true. But yeah, it has changed a lot of things, that Colgan Air crash, as tragic as it was. Hopefully good things come out of it. So we're going to learn kind of the reality of this today, right? A little bit. We're going to get to tag along with you and see what way beyond at least the private Checkride is with the ATP-CTP. So you've already kind of talked about how, it kind of went along with the 1,500 hours. That means, people going into ATP-CTP are a lot more experienced flying than in the past before 2007, 2008, once they were already flying for the airlines, right? So does that make a big difference, do you think?
I've heard a lot of people say, do you have 1,500 hours or do you have 1 hour 1,500 times? Obviously, you learn a lot more when you're new at something than you do down the road. So that's why there's some debate about whether that 1,500 hour rule really is making that big of a difference, because is another 1,000 times around the pattern in that 172 really going to make the difference between a good pilot and a bad pilot when it comes to flying a jet? But really, that's what the ATP-CTP course is about, is bridging the gap from the right seat of a 172 to the right seat of a jet. And it is a completely different experience flying a jet than it is flying a single piston.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's kind of, you go through levels of professionalism through your career, and going from, like you said, the right seat of a 172 to the right seat of a jet is a big leap. So there probably needs to be some good training there.
Definitely.
So a lot of people may not even know what ATP-CTP is. Do you want to explain it a little bit?
So it is that bridge from the single engine piston world to the jet world. That's what it was always intended to be. Even though Congress forced the extra training on us, it was the FAA that kind of decided what really should go into that training. And there are a number of what you might call landmark accidents that the causes of them all went into this course. Obviously, at this point, you could call Colgan 3407 a landmark accident just because of how much it changed the industry. Some other ones that are looked, at least in the course I took, Air France 447, which was the one that was flying from South America to Paris and was stalled at a high altitude and remained stalled all the way into the ocean. So aerodynamics at high altitudes and stall recoveries at high altitudes are covered in the course. But there's a whole lot of stuff around professionalism, which was somewhat lacking in that cockpit as well as in some other accidents. I don't have the flight number in front of me right now, but there was I honestly forget which regional it was, but it was Northwest Airlink, where it was just a deadhead flight. And there were two young pilots who made a lot of bad decisions and had an unprofessional environment in the cockpit, managed to get both engines to flame out on the jet that they were flying and crashed it. All of those different accidents that the FAA looked at and said, hey, we can do better and we need to do better, are covered in the course. So we can kind of go through some of the subject matter, and I think we will here, but I'll let you take the lead on where we go with this.
Sure. Well, I just want to get a couple of personal things out of the way that, worked out for you. What did your total time and ratings look like when you went in, so our listeners can kind of get an idea of where you were at in your career?
I looked very different from the rest of the people in the course because, again, most of them, with maybe 3 exceptions, were that person who's been sitting in the right seat of 172 teaching people how to fly. and they're getting to that point where they're close to 1,500 hours, and they want to be able to take that ATP written and get that out of the way and put it on their resume so that they can hopefully get hired by an airline. Yeah, I had almost 3,000 hours, several hundred hours of turbine time, experience as a 135 captain, but it was all in single engine turboprop. So I did not have the multi-engine ATP. So I probably got some different things out of the course than some other people did. And I nodded my head a lot. I was director of safety at that former 135 that I was at. So I have seen a lot of stuff about a lot of these accidents and written things about them and tried to take the lessons from them and communicate them to pilots myself before. Definitely was a different experience for me than it was for some of the other people in there.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because you come in with a, like you said, you're not a CFI. You came in with a lot of different experience, a lot of real world experience, and a lot of professional flying experience. So with that in mind, do you think it was more or less rigorous than you expected, or kind of what you expected?
Well, I have heard from some people that their experience with that course was that it was taught by somebody who didn't really know anything and just played them a bunch of YouTube videos, which is really unfortunate.
That's unfortunate. Yeah.
My experience was the guy that taught the ground portion of my ATP-CTP course was a retired American captain, and he did a great job. And he gave some of the backstory on some of the accidents that involved American that don't make it into the NTSB report. There was one in particular that was a weather-related crash where all these other flights were getting canceled, and this guy apparently had a mistress at the destination that they were going to that night.
Oh, my goodness.
And went around looking for an airplane at a gate that was flyable, and then up dispatch and said, "Hey, I found an airplane here, and I want to go." And unfortunately, that led to his death as well as several others when they crashed at the destination. Mm-hmm. So a lot of interesting backstories there, though. And part of what you get from that is just that, what was this person's decision-making mentality that day? Because that really affects the outcome of some of these things. Your decision-making is really what makes you a good or a bad pilot. So it's always important to keep that in mind and make sure you're in the right frame of mind when you're making those decisions. So I really felt like I got a lot of good value out of that course, hearing some of that extra stuff. But yeah, I thought he did a really great job.
That sounds good. It sounds like it was probably a pretty good experience for you. So what study materials did you use? Did you have a sense for how some of the approved programs for ATP-CTP differ?
Well, there really weren't any study materials. That's the kind of the whole thing with this ATP-CTP. It's just ground and sim. There is no Checkride or any of that kind of stuff. And so it was actually kind of nice to have a training experience where you can just kind of go into it with an open mind and just sit back and soak it in. Got a lot of good value out of it, but didn't really have to put a ton into it before it started.
All right, excellent. Well, was there anything that surprised you about the content?
Not a lot, mostly because, like I said, I've been in aviation safety before, and I've been around flying for over 20 years now, and so, I remember a lot of these crashes when they happened.
Right.
In fact, I knew a guy who was flying for Colgan at the time 3407 crashed, and I remember Air France 447. I have a lot of thoughts on that particular crash. But so, yeah, I was aware of almost all of the stuff in the course already, but, hearing it from the perspective of a guy who's been an airline captain for 40 years, that was really a good experience.
All right. So did you choose the provider who did the class, or was that chosen for you by your employer, or how did that work?
No, I actually did this class before I got my current job. The hiring market here in the last couple of years, ever since the door plug blew out of the Alaska Airlines 737, has not been great. And so anything you can do to make yourself look better is a good thing. And so I just kind of did this one on my own dime just to say, yeah, I checked that box already.
Well, that's actually good for us for this discussion. How did you choose the provider? What process did you go through? Was it word of mouth? Did you do some research?
Well, I actually called up our old buddy Steve Tupper because I knew he had done it and asked him what his experience was like. And I looked at a couple of other providers and they were kind of all the same price. They were all like right at $4,000. And it just so happened I could get in with this one the quickest.
And were you pretty familiar with ATP-CTP before going in? I know you were familiar with the concepts, but had you really heard a lot about how these programs run, or did you kind of have to learn it as you went along?
I've talked to a couple people about it, and like I said, I had heard from some people that it was just being fed some YouTube videos in a classroom, and they were pretty disappointed with it. But that wasn't my experience, which I'm very glad for.
Yeah, choosing the provider is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and honestly, I think I got lucky because I may have actually had the same provider as some of the people who didn't have a good experience. So
just not the same instructor.
May have just been the luck of the draw that I got the good instructor as opposed to the one who maybe wasn't even a pilot.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to ask you to dive into kind of the content of the program a little bit so you can be ready for that. But before we do that, I wanted to get a sense from you on how your fellow classmates, the other pilots, did you find that they were generally taking it really seriously, being really professional, or was it kind of a checkbox item for a lot of them?
I think, it seemed like everybody in my class was really into it and paying attention for the most part, even though and this is one of the other reasons I went with this particular provider, I was in a remote course. So the ground for mine, I was able to be at home.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And everyone else was as well. Now, part of that is that they actually have someone watching you. You have to have your camera turned on, and they have, in addition to the instructor, they have a monitor whose entire job is to sit there and watch everybody's video feed. And if it looks like you're not paying attention, they're going to squawk at you.
Interesting.
In fact, right. I was warned about that in advance because, like some other people, I have several monitors on my home setup. And so
yeah. You really want to be looking into it, right?
I'm sitting here looking at you on my laptop, but over here is my notes, and over here's, a web browser and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, Kent, if you don't mind, why don't you take us through the content of the course, what it's like. Let's start with the regulatory portions, what's required to be in there, and then we'll kind of finish up with your experience, what you talked about, what you learned, the different experiences with the sim, because I believe there's a sim component for this, right? So
there is.
Yeah. So let's start with the regulatory. Like, what is required to be part of this class?
So it's 30 hours of classroom and 10 hours in the sim is the minimum requirement. The classroom is split up into 8 hours of aerodynamics, including high altitude aerodynamics, 2 hours of meteorology and weather detection systems, aka onboard radar, 14 hours of air carrier operations, which is split into a bunch of things that I can go through here in a sec. And then 6 hours of leadership, professional development, CRM, and safety culture. That 14 hours of air carrier operations covers physiology, communications, checklist philosophy, operational control, minimum equipment list, and CDL. I'm blanking on the configuration deviation list. Ground operations, turbine engines, transport category performance, and then automation, navigation, and flight path warning systems. So all stuff that's more geared toward high altitude operations, multi-crew operations, turbine operations, the air carrier operations, getting into parts 121, 135, 125, all of those different things that are very different than your single engine piston operations that most people are coming from.
Cool. All right. So from a regulatory standpoint, this is found in 61-156, I believe. Those are the things that have to be covered.
Yep.
So take us through a little bit of that. What was it like for you? What were some of the aha moments and things like that?
Well, again, I already had experience with some of this stuff just because I had previous 135 experience, but I'll kind of just start at the top here and throw a few things out there. Aerodynamics and high altitude operations. Things are different when you're way up there in the really thin air. If you think about your minimum speed where you're going to stall versus your maximum speed where you're going to hit, in a piston, it's VNE. In a turbine aircraft, you'd usually have a VMO and an MMO, maximum operating. As you climb, that minimum speed is going to be faster and faster. Really, it's going to be roughly the same indicated airspeed, but of course, as you climb, you are going faster for the same indicated airspeed because the air is getting thinner. But the other thing that's happening is at the other end, so your minimum speed's going like this, your maximum speed is coming down. And so you get into a situation called coffin corner, where in certain aircraft types, there's only maybe 10 knots in between your maximum speed and your minimum speed when you get high enough. I think that applies to some of the Lears and probably the Citation 10. That's, some of these planes are certified up to 51,000 feet. And so when you get really high like that, things are very different. So that's one thing that they talk about.
Explain aerodynamically. This is where we get to geek out. Explain aerodynamically what the dangers are there, in Coffin's Corner, so to speak.
Well, if you got all the way to the altitude where those meet, you are simultaneously at, your maximum speed and your stall speed at the same time, which obviously you can't really get all the way to the corner there, but you have an ever decreasing margin for speed on either side of where you are. And,
a student pilot practices stalls all the time. What's different about stalls at those high altitudes? That's kind of that danger area, right?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that they covered in the sim was high altitude stalls, because it's not like it just kind of, pitches over on you. It's going to start to buffet first. And one of the points that they were really trying to make was that, yeah, you may be in a transport category jet with tons and tons of thrust at takeoff, but really a jet engine is a normally aspirated engine. It is turbine, but it is a normally aspirated engine. The higher you climb,
the air going in is still, at
and
pressure.
So you don't necessarily have as much excess thrust up at altitude as you do down low. And so one of the things that they demonstrated with us in the sim was that you cannot power out of a stall even with a couple of big jet engines on you. And that was an eye-opener. They basically had us get it to the first indication of a stall at 35,000 feet and then try and power out of it. And they timed it, and it took 2 full minutes to recover from the stall by trying to hold altitude and power out of it. And so the point there was you got to get that nose down. Now, you don't want to be going negative G on a transport category jet. All kinds of bad things can happen, not the least of which would be you might be unporting your fuel and then causing your engines to quit too, which, that's going to be a really bad day. And so your recovery is to drop a wing and get the nose down quickly that way without causing negative G. And then, you get the nose quite a bit down, like
really
20
down,
degrees
yeah.
down. So you don't see any blue at all in the window. And then you get that airspeed back up first, and then you start to recover. And that recovery, when you're that high, I think we ate up 6,000 or 8,000 feet of altitude in the recovery. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot when you're in a normally aspirated piston, and you're at 3,000, 4,000 feet AGL maybe, and maybe not even that much. And that's where we all learned stalls, and that's where we all practice stalls. And so, we're kind of thinking, okay, I'm going to real briefly get the nose down, relax that back pressure, lower the angle of attack, and the wing's going to start flying again right away. And then I need to get that nose back up, not too fast to cause a secondary stall, but I need to get that nose back up and climb away from the ground because, hey, the ground is right there, right? But when you're at 35,000 feet, it doesn't matter if you lose 8,000 feet in the recovery because you're still, well, I guess that would get you down to about Everest altitude. So the highest point of land in the entire world is 27,028 feet, if I remember correctly. And so, yeah, you have thousands of feet in which to recover, so use it. And it's just a very different maneuver than the one that we all learned and practiced. And because of the fact that both Colgan 3407 and Air France 447 that we've already talked about, stalls were part of both of those accidents. And so stall awareness and recovery is a big part of what they wanted to go into this ATP-CTP course.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool stuff. See, we get to geek out.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So what other kinds of things did you go over in that, those mandatory topics that you thought was interesting?
I could talk a little bit about weather radar. We did have weather radar on the TBMs that I was flying before, but it was very nice, new generation Garmin's latest and greatest fun toys. And, most airplanes now have relatively modern radars. Some are more automated than the others. But, before you've actually operated an onboard radar, it kind of sounds like, oh, this will be the greatest thing ever, and it will tell me everything I need to know, and it won't have any of the weaknesses of NEXRAD and all that.
I can really poke my way through these storms, right?
Yeah, not so much. They both NEXRAD data link radar and onboard weather radar have a place, and I actually really like having both. They each have their own weaknesses, but when you have both, you can kind of use them to mitigate the weaknesses of the other one. We, of course, have the luxury now of having NEXRAD in our cockpits in normally aspirated piston aircraft, which is just a massive increase in safety and dispatchability for small airplanes since I started flying. Before we had ADS-B and XM weather and that sort of thing available in the cockpit, I remember taking a trip where I called Flight Watch. If you remember, Flight Watch doesn't exist anymore, but it was a flight service provided service. And you called in on this frequency and you'd be listening through a VOR, and a guy in a room somewhere would be telling you that there's an area of thunderstorms that's, 100 miles wide and it's centered 30 miles north of some VOR you've never heard of and have no idea where it is. And it was just not the most useful thing in the world. Maybe better than nothing, but only marginally. So having the visualization and really knowing where that is relative to you is just a huge increase in capability for small airplanes. And I use it all the time in my Mooney. However, it has weaknesses, right? If you get a picture that says it's, from right now, it's already about 10 minutes old because the radar has to sweep all the different altitudes, and then it puts all those pictures together, sends it out, got to go up to satellites and back down potentially, but it takes a while to put the picture together and transmit it. And that time that you see on it is the time that it was transmitted, not the time that it started being built. So even if it says you have a brand new picture, it's still up to 10 minutes old. And then on top of that, it sometimes takes 5 or 10 additional minutes to get that picture to you. So now you're talking about you might have a picture that's 20 minutes old when you're looking at NEXRAD. Onboard radar is real time, which is great. But onboard radar also only shows you right. And it's you have that arc in front of you about 45 degrees either side of your nose. It's only good for a certain distance out in front of you. It depends on the size of the radar antenna. The bigger antennas are kind of more focused, and so you get a beam that goes farther before it starts getting into ground clutter and such. But speaking of ground clutter, that stuff all gets automatically filtered out of that NEXRAD image. It doesn't get filtered out of your onboard radar image. So then you're starting to deal with, okay, is there a huge line of storms out there, or am I just painting the ground? And you can usually kind of tell the difference once you've played with it for a while. The ground is always going to be painted a certain distance out, but it's a much more manual process. Nobody is filtering things out or doing any of those things for you. You have to gain the knowledge to be able to say, okay, what tilt do I want on my radar? Where am I going to get the best chance of actually seeing the precip? And also, am I potentially overshooting some precip in an attempt to get rid of that ground clutter on my screen? Or, the opposite problem is if your tilt is too low, you might paint some precip that you're going to be 10,000 feet over the top of, and you don't really need to worry about. So there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more that goes into the interpretation of the onboard radar. And it also suffers from attenuation sometimes. So if you have a really big, strong cell that's close to you, you can't see anything that's behind it.
Right.
So the NEXRAD has different sights that can make up for that.
Perspectives of it, yeah.
Right. And so that's where being able to see both pictures is really valuable. You could say, okay, not only is there this one that's close to me, but if I go around it, I'm going to get into even more trouble. And that sort of stuff doesn't show up on the onboard radar. So, just learning all those strengths and weaknesses of each system and how to interpret them and use them together is really valuable. And I think I may have actually gone into more detail just now than they did in the course because they talked more about onboard radar because, a lot of airliners don't have data link.
Right. Yeah.
Believe it or not, in the jets I'm flying now, we don't have ADS-B that gets fed to our iPads. Our iPads are not connected to the panel at all. We can connect to the internet on our planes, and so we can get we can get the NEXRAD picture in our ForeFlight through the internet instead.
Yeah. So I want to make a note for our listeners. I'm sure everybody's thinking to themselves, well, what is the type that you're flying? But hold on. We're going to do another episode about his type rating, and we'll talk all about the airplane. So for now, just be patient. All right. So
sounds good.
I'd like to switch over a little bit before we get into the air carrier operations portion, which of course has a lot of different categories or a lot of different, segments of information. I'd like to talk a little bit about the leadership part. How did you find that? Did you take away some good tools on leadership, CRM, things like that?
CRM, I had already had CRM training before that, so that wasn't really new to me, and that's something that you can find in a lot of places. I think especially just because we had this really experienced airline captain teaching the course. Probably the best thing I got out of that was how to communicate with your passengers. He was very particular about a few things. Like he said, do not ever lie to your passengers, because if they figure that out, it's game over. They're never going to trust you.
Trust is gone. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And, and I have a friend who is also a retired airline captain who we got into this same kind of discussion. And he was talking about how, if you get everybody on the same team, things go better. And he said, for example, you're on a flight, it's already delayed, and then the airplane breaks. And there's different ways you can communicate that to people. But he said, if you just get everybody on the same team, great things happen. If you say, hey, look, everybody, I know this sucks, and I'm not real happy about it either, but we have a maintenance issue with our airplane. We're going to need to switch to a different airplane. But if we can all help each other out, we'll get onto this other airplane as quickly as possible, and we'll get on our way as soon as we can. And he said, once you do that and you get people helping each other out, everybody's happier. It's not, well, I'm mad at the airline or I'm mad at the captain or whatever. It's, hey, let's help each other out. And, we all have the common goal of getting to where we're going. So, if we help each other out, we can do it. And so just how you communicate with your passengers is extremely important. And he just had all kinds of really, really good examples of that.
Excellent. Well, everybody talks about leadership, CRM, things like that. Was there any part of that training that was, I don't know the best term for this, so I'm going to make one up, that was more like how to be better at followership, how to be a good junior crew member, things like that?
I would actually have to look at my notes for that. I think there was some talk about that, but I guess, one of the things that he was talking about was warning the pilot flying, or the PIC, and how to do that, because there have been some instances where, for example, the worst airline crash there's ever been, the Tenerife crash, where two 747s hit each other on the runway, 583 people killed. One of the things that went into that was a TWA and a KLM. And on the KLM flight, they had been cleared essentially to line up and wait, not cleared for takeoff. And the captain read back, "We are at takeoff." He didn't say cleared for takeoff. So there was some ambiguity to what he said, but he shoved the throttles forward. And the first officer said, "Are we cleared for takeoff?" And the captain said, "Jawel," which in Dutch is an emphatic yes. And the first officer didn't say anything more.
Yeah.
And then this crash happened. So he gave a really good example of, in fact, I'm going to go back to my notes and read this off. Cuss words, he called it. Concerned, uncomfortable, safe. And then also said, okay, inquiry, advocacy, and assertion are kind of the three levels. So the first thing you do is you say, hey, are we cleared for takeoff? And if you get a response that's not satisfactory, then the second one is, hey, I don't think we were cleared for takeoff. Let's double check this before we do anything. The third step is, hey, we're not cleared for takeoff. Abort, abort, abort. So yeah, starting with a warning, then a more emphatic warning, then a very emphatic, do it now, and then take over the aircraft. Which hopefully nobody ever gets to that point where they have to literally take over the aircraft. Because at that point,
that would be some pretty poor leadership.
A massive breakdown.
Yep. Yeah, really interesting. Of course, that crash you're speaking of happened in kind of a different time. There were different safety cultures and CRM practices at the time, and it's the reason we've tried to change that culture in the industry, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that crash was in about 1983 or so, if I remember right. It was the early 80s, one way or the other. And I know that the crash that really brought CRM to the forefront and caused the FAA to make everybody do CRM training was United Flight 232, which, kind of like the Miracle on the Hudson, was one of the rare airline crashes where instead of looking at everything that went wrong, they can look at what went right. Because even though United 232 did have quite a few fatalities, it also had a lot of survivors in a situation where you wouldn't expect that at all. And for those who aren't familiar, that flight is that flight is the one. It was a DC-10, I think, just going from Denver to Chicago. And the number 2 engine, the one on the tail, had an uncontained failure and just shredded a lot of stuff, including all 4 hydraulic systems on the airplane. And so the flight crew did not have any control of the flying surfaces on the airplane anymore. But they used what they had available, which was their remaining 2 engines, and got the airplane to an airport, which was huge. Crash, fire, and rescue that's been trained and everything. And so, yeah, a bunch of people survived that, when that sort of crash is not something you might ever expect anybody to be able to survive, when you literally have a yoke in front of you that does nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, after that crash,
pretty incredible.
The FAA went, hey, what did these guys do that made this go as well as it did? And one of the things that they discovered is that United had been doing this crew resource management training for about 10 years before that. And they had more of a culture of listening to
anybody
the first
have any ideas
as opposed to right, exactly.
Yeah.
And not anymore the old culture of what the captain says goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now
very
it's
cool.
biggest chicken wins.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, let's dive into a couple of the things in air carrier operations. And if you don't touch on one or two of them, I might bring them up because I'm pretty interested myself.
Okay. I guess I'll start, and this is not necessarily part of the course, but just from my own experience, I want to talk about what's different about air carrier operations, and this will touch on operational control, which is one of the items here that's on the list of required things. For an air carrier operation, and this can be Part 121 airline, this can be Part 135 charter, anybody who's required to have a certificate. In fact, I would actually lump the 91K operators in there, the net jets and stuff. Even though it's technically Part 91, it is a lot more regulated than the rest of Part 91. But any air carrier in those groups is going to have what are called operational specifications, op specs, which is basically a list of what they are allowed to do. And sometimes those things even allow you to, I don't necessarily want to say violate the regulations. It basically gives you relief from some regulations. For example, one op spec that it's possible to get in Part 135 is normally any IFR flight with passengers under Part 135 has to have 2 pilots. But there is one op spec that's available that allows you to use a 3-axis autopilot in lieu of the second crew member. Some carriers have that, some don't. So every carrier is going to have certain op specs that allow them to do what they want to do, and those all have to be approved and signed off by the FAA. And the FAA, of course, has criteria that have to be met before those get signed off. The other thing that all air carriers are going to have is either an FOM, Flight Operations Manual, or a GOM, which is a General Operations Manual. They're essentially the same thing. The op specs and the regulations are what you have to do. The GOM or the FOM is going to be how you comply with all of those things. So lots of standard operating procedures and all that kind of stuff. So every air carrier is going to have that level of structure to their flying. And it really does help safety. It's one of those things that until you've kind of been in the system, it seems like, well, this is unnecessary. This doesn't sound like fun anymore, or that kind of stuff. But it really does improve safety, especially, the larger carrier you get to. If you're flying at a major airline, you are never, ever flying with the same people. You're going to be with a crew for one 4-day trip or something like that. And
really
then you'll probably never see them again.
Yeah.
Right. And so everybody has to do everything the exact same way so that there are no surprises, because some of the crashes they talked about in this ATP-CTP course, and, just that crash we were talking about just now, we are at takeoff. That's non-standard phraseology. Shouldn't happen, because it allows there to be the potential of miscommunication. And so that structure is really what's common to all air carriers. So now that I have that out of the way, a lot of these things that they put under the heading of air carrier operations are really more about, jet operations and, turbine operations, high altitude operations still. So physiology is the first one on the list. A lot of that is oxygen deprivation type stuff. There are some other things that they deal with, but that's probably the biggest one. Yes. Yep. The higher up you are, the shorter that time period is. I will recommend here, several years ago, maybe even a decade ago now, I went down to FAA headquarters in Oklahoma City, and I did the oxygen chamber training that they have, and it was fantastic. You get to experience hypoxia for yourself, and everybody experiences it differently. And so that training is all about just recognizing what your particular symptoms are. They have a bunch of training videos that they go through there as well. One of which is the chamber training they do, they only take you up to 25,000 feet at most. They don't need to be doing things like knocking you out or anything like that for you to get the experience. But they do show some videos of people. They showed an old video of an airline captain essentially being at 35,000 feet. Again, this was in a chamber, so he wasn't really up in the sky, but they had him at that pressure. And yeah, it was 4 or 5 seconds, and he was useless. So I definitely recommend that as something that people should consider going and doing if you have the ability to take a few days and travel to Oklahoma City. The training itself was only 1 day, but it does start right away in the morning, so you need to get there the day before, and you can't fly for 24 hours after you're done, so you need to stay for another day. Well, it's something that any pilot can go and do for free. Yeah. Obviously you'll have travel costs to get there, but they don't charge anything for the course. You just have to get on the list, which is not always easy, but it's absolutely well worth it. If you're a CFI, go and take your students with you. Mm-hmm. It was well worth it.
Well, I have a question for you in that category of air carrier operations. We, several episodes ago, did an episode on checklists for Beyond the Checkride. And I know that checklist philosophy is one of the areas that's covered. Any epiphanies or anything that you want to bring up, or was it pretty much everything we'd already talked about?
Well, I don't know how much we talked about in terms of checklist philosophy as it relates to multi-crew operations. I think we were talking more about building your own checklists.
Yeah, and single pilot operations mostly.
Right. So really, checklist philosophy comes down to how you use checklists in a crew environment. For example, always read the name of the checklist when you're starting the checklist. There are checklists that are similar, and once in a while, in fact, my current employer changed the name of some checklists because they had some checklists that had the same name, and you use them at different points of the flight.
That's confusing.
So, transition altitude checklist, right? Well, you use that going up and going down. So now we have a transition altitude checklist, and we have a transition level checklist. You know, altitude is on the way up, level's on the way down. So, yeah, you always want to be reading the name of the checklist and make sure that you're on the right one. You always want to say checklist complete when you're done. Taxi checklist complete. Great. You do not want to stop, or you don't want to skip things in the middle of a checklist. If you need to stop a checklist for any reason, you know, if there's some item you can't do yet, you stop. And then when you can complete the checklist, you
don't say, "Oh, we'll come back to this."
Right. And this applies to single engine piston operations. I can tell you that we had an incident in the flying club where somebody was flying the R182 and decided to do his before landing checklist early. And hey, nothing wrong with getting things done early, right? Staying ahead of the plane. The problem was it was at a point where he was going too fast to put the gear down. And so he did the rest of the checklist and put it down. And then just due to some quirks of how the gear warning system works in that plane and the techniques he was using for his approach and landing, the gear warning system did not go off until he was in the flare. Because, on the R182, if you're not at full flaps, the only other trigger is that you're below 12 inches of manifold pressure, which really doesn't happen until you're pulling the power out at landing. Well, it's an old airplane. It doesn't say gear up, gear up. It goes do-do-do-do-do-do. And you might be expecting a beeper or a buzzer or something to go off when you're landing for the stall, right? And in the half a second or a second it took him to process that was the gear warning and not the stall warning that was going off, the prop hit the runway. So that's when I learned that is, you don't keep going with the checklist. If you can't do all the things on the checklist, you just stop. If there's something else on the checklist you want to do, you can do it, but you don't actually continue reading the checklists, and you definitely don't say checklist complete.
Right.
At a previous carrier, we had a rule that you had to be physically holding onto the checklist until it was done.
I like that.
I still do that now.
Yep. I teach that actually. Single pilot operations is obviously what I'm teaching, and it's a little bit different than a crewed environment. So you have to do your own checks and balances, right? So that's one of them.
Well, and something that might work well for single pilots, I like to, when I'm creating a checklist, like we talked about in that previous episode, I like to have something somehow that's unique to that checklist. And that way, if I am wondering, did I complete that checklist? I have one thing I can look at, and I can, it'll be a switch or something like that. And I can say, okay, that switch is not on. I didn't finish that checklist.
Yep.
It's a lot easier when you have two crew and you can go to the other guy. Hey, did we do that checklist?
It's a true challenge response in that case. Yeah.
Right. But if there's, sometimes even if you did, you just go, I'm not sure we did that on this leg. Let's just do it again.
I'm doing it again. Yep. Exactly.
No harm in that.
I also teach to do a flow and then check your flow with the checklist.
Yep.
That way you've
Checklist
got
should be a
two
checklist,
chances
not
to
a do list.
Exactly.
Yep.
Cool. Well, that's good stuff. All right. Another thing I'm curious about is ground operations. What was talked about in ground operations?
I guess in performance, they talked about VMCG, which is your minimum directional control speed on the ground. If you've ever wondered why on some of the bigger jets, they push the power halfway up and then sit there and wait for a second and then push it the rest of the way up, that's because the engines are going to spool up at different speeds. And it's possible if you just took the throttles and shoved them all the way from idle to full, that one engine would spool up a bunch more than the other, and then the airplane would turn on the ground. You know, your nose wheel would just go skidding sideways. And so they push it to 50%, wait for the engines to spool up, so that when they push it the rest of the way, they should be synced up enough to maintain control.
So you don't end up with significantly different differential thrust or something. Interesting. Right. Well, anything else in the air carrier operations, a list of topics that stand out to you that you want to talk about? Or should we move on to the fun stuff, the sim?
Well, let's talk for a little bit about the automation, navigation, and flight path warning systems. Again, you know, there are plenty of 172s out there that have, you know, G1000 and have all kinds of bells and whistles that, you know, we didn't necessarily have in the past. You know, really advanced autopilots. But airline operations, you're going to have a pretty advanced autopilot. You're going to have things like EGPWS that aren't going to be on a small airplane. TCAS that's not going to be on a small airplane. So they went through things like, you know, well, and this is partially in the sim as well, but so the EGPWS that I mentioned a second ago, that's EGPWS, Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning System. So when that goes off, there is an escape maneuver that you execute immediately, no questions asked, because you don't want to go splat. And they talked at length about American Flight 965 in Cali, Colombia. This was back in about 1995. I believe it was a 757 on approach in a country that, you know, and this is before GPS even. They were on an NDB approach. And there was some confusion about where exactly they were, because apparently there were multiple NDBs in various points of the world that had the same identifier as the one that they needed. And there was, I forget exactly what it was. There was something about their database and how they were trying to program this stuff into their flight management system where it completely screwed up their navigation. And so they ended up in the process of trying to fix this, pointed at a mountain, and eventually got the ground proximity warning system, and they tried to climb out of it, but unfortunately they still had their air brakes on because they were trying to come down initially. And it sounds like that if they had not had their air brakes out, they might have made it. They might have been able to outclimb that mountain. But unfortunately, they crashed, and all but 4 people on the plane were killed. So, you know, big accident for American. And of course, that captain that was our instructor remembered it vividly. So, yeah, they talked a lot about navigation in situations like that where you don't have the latest and greatest, you know, ways that even your latest and greatest stuff can mess you up. So, important stuff to learn.
Well, let's talk about the sim. And my first question for you is, how was that UPRT training? What was that like in the sim?
Well, that was maybe the most interesting part of the sim training.
I would think so.
I ended up in the Airbus A320 sim, which in itself was interesting. It is not, like I said, there's no Checkride for this, and so it doesn't really matter what aircraft type you end up in. There is a minimum weight that the aircraft, minimum weight of the aircraft that the simulator is supposed to be for. I know some people have gotten the 737 as well, and that seems to be roughly the class of aircraft that the ATP-CTP courses go for, is the A320 or 737, mid-sized airline jet. But yeah, the A320, of course, is a highly automated, some may say over-automated airplane, and it's a little bit weird to fly because of that. So it was interesting getting into that, and I would not say I necessarily know anything about how the Airbus itself works, but yeah, I actually managed to, I wouldn't say crash the sim in the airplane sense, but I would say I crashed the sim in the IT sense
Gotcha.
on one of the recoveries, because it just stopped and said, please call the sim maintenance people. And then we had about an hour break while they put it back to a state where it would work again.
You're always breaking stuff.
I am. I mean, that's what IT guys do, right? We break it and then we reboot it. But so what happened? You have to recover from increasingly unusual attitudes. And this was the weirdest one, where you're starting partially upside down. You're at 120 degrees of bank, and you have to recover. So, I was in a 120 degree left bank. So what do? Move the stick to the right. Well, airplane starts rolling back towards level, and I neutralize the stick, and it just keeps rolling, and I start going to the left with the stick, and it just keeps rolling to the right. Didn't seem like I had any control of it whatsoever. And when it got to about 120 degrees to the right, then it finally started rolling back toward level, and it had this repeated oscillation between about 120 degree left bank and 120 degree right bank. So
and what was causing that? Was it altitude, speed, combination of both? I have a theory,
but I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
So at first, like I said, I was putting the stick toward where it needed to go for level flight. And then when it got to level, I was, neutralizing, and then
relaxing
when it went to the other side, then I would go opposite the roll. Eventually I went, okay, this thing isn't recovering that way, so I need to get farther ahead of it. And so then when I got to one side, let's say to the left, I would actually, so as soon as it started rolling to the right, even though I was already at 120 degree left bank, I went full left stick, and it would still bank all the way through level back to the other side.
Huh.
And so as far ahead of it as I could get, I still never got control of it. Now, I'd be interested in hearing from any Airbus pilots out there if this was just a quirk of how the Airbus flight control system works, or, what their theory might be. If I were to say, if this were to have happened in a 737 or something else that doesn't have the crazy fly-by-wire system that Airbus has, where the computer is a higher priority than the pilot, I might have thought, okay, maybe what's happening is that by putting in that left aileron input or whatever, my right aileron is going down and potentially becoming stalled, and that's why it's going the other way on me. That's really the only theory I had that made any aerodynamic sense.
Right.
But yeah, like I said, the Airbus flight control system is another variable that I just don't know enough about to be able to say, well, here's what was actually happening. But yeah, after several oscillations, both directions to upside down like that, yeah, the sim just went, we're not doing this anymore.
Yeah. Well, it had to be pretty fun though, right? It was a pretty fun experience.
Oh, yeah.
To do UPRT
Definitely.
in a big jet like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So what else about the sim stood out to you?
Well, with the Airbus, a lot of it was just how automated everything was. You pretty much, there's a certain detent that you went to on takeoff. It's the second one from all the way forward. It's called flex. And you push the throttles into that for takeoff. And I believe we pulled them back, or maybe we didn't. We may have pulled them back one detent into climb and then just left it there. But really, the auto throttles do everything. And so you don't touch the throttles again until it's time to chop them at landing. So that was a little bit weird, but then getting into this Airbus thing where it's just like you don't touch anything until you're about to
all
land.
automated.
That was a little bit weird.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that hands-off flying though in certain circumstances is what gets pilots into trouble, to get you into an unusual attitude or a stall or something like that. So, yeah, interesting. All right. So, remind me, was it 6 hours of sim?
10 hours total of sim.
10 hours of sim. That's right. 10 hours of sim.
6 hours of stall and upset recovery, icing and thunderstorms, and then 4 hours of navigation and automation.
And your sim training, was that 10 hours, 5 in each seat? Or...
Yes.
Different role? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So you basically both go through everything in the left seat, but you have a sim partner as well. So, if it says 2 hours of training on something, you're doing 1 hour in the left seat, 1 hour in the right seat.
All right. Cool. So tell me, something you did in the sim that you, besides that 120-degree bank, that is something that you just wouldn't be able to do in a real aircraft. I think you did some stall recoveries or something like that, right?
Yeah, we talked about the high altitude stall recovery a little bit earlier, and how you can't power out of it. So that was one thing. And you could do that in an airplane. There's a lot of sky up there. You would just have to get a clearance to do it. But jets are expensive, and so most people aren't going to pay you to do a stall recovery at altitude. So that kind of stuff is always going to be done in the sim. But then the stuff that really has to be done in the sim, they had the ground proximity escape maneuver and wind shear escape maneuvers and stuff like that. And of course, then, there are plenty of other things that are not really in the ATP-CTP course that are more in the type rating course that would be things that you don't really do in an airplane, like cutting your engine at V1 and all that sort of thing. So there's some value to training in airplanes, but you can do a lot of things in a sim that you would never do in an actual airplane.
Yeah. All right. Well, overall, let's take it a little higher level. As we talked about earlier, it's all started with that Colgan Air crash. In your opinion, after having gone through it, do you think the ATP-CTP makes airline and business aviation safer? Or is this more of a compliance exercise?
Well, I think some of it depends on whether you get a good instructor. And I was lucky enough to get a good instructor. I'm glad I got a good instructor rather than someone who just clicked play on YouTube videos. And don't get me wrong, we watched plenty of videos. There's actually some good stuff out there. In fact, I kind of was trying to take notes as to what some of the videos were that we saw. And they used stuff that was on, Nat Geo TV. They actually even had Captain Joe on YouTube and Bold Method and Smithsonian Channel, Mentor Pilot, so they used videos from a number of different sources.
All right. Well, cool. So overall, then you feel like there's, as long as you get the right instructor, you feel like there's good value there, huh?
Yeah. And, it depends on you as well. If you go
Sure.
into it with the attitude of, well, this is just a box to check and this whole thing is stupid and it's Congress's fault we have to do this, you're not necessarily going to get anything out of it. You really do have to think about all these accidents that they're telling you about and how it relates to your own flying. And that's where having worn that director of safety hat, I think, helped me out a fair bit as well, because in the course of doing that job, I kind of figured out that, everything is human factors. And it's real easy to read an NTSB report or watch a video about an airline crash and say, that's just stupid. I would never do that.
Right.
Well,
right.
I can tell you, not a single one of those pilots went to work that day and said, I'm going to crash an airplane. I'm going to do something dumb and crash an airplane.
Yeah.
One of the quotes that I just saw you highlighting there, and this came from Captain Sigmund, who taught that class. He said, "You never know on which flight your career will be judged." Yeah. So, are you going to be Sully, or are you going to be somebody who made a stupid mistake and crashed? And that's all up to how you operate every day. It's about attitude. Just showing up for this class with the right attitude, it's kind of like showing up to fly with the right attitude as well. What can I learn from it? Not, oh, geez, I have to check this box. But one of the things that I kind of learned as a director of safety is that the NTSB kind of stops short of the true cause of an accident in a lot of cases. Sometimes they catch it, but there are an awful lot of accidents where it's just blamed on pilot error, right?
Yeah.
But when you start doing root cause analysis, it's more, you keep asking why until you get to the end of the line. And so you have to ask, okay, why did that pilot make that error? Was it because they had a bad attitude that day, because of something else that was going on in their life? Was it because they weren't properly trained? Was it because there was a conflict between the two crew members or a communication issue or something like that? So you really have to come at every flight and every training event with the right attitude and see what you can get from it, as opposed to just, well, I'm just going to get through this.
Yeah. A lot of it has to do with what's going on in between the pilot's ears, right?
Yep.
The head work
The
is
most unreliable
the most
part of any airplane is the nut between the yoke and the seat.
Yep. Excellent. All right. Well, one last question for you. Overall, take a young 200-hour pilot. What would you want him or her to know about what's coming up later in their career about ATP-CTP? Is there something in general or some concepts that you wish you had known when you were younger that headed you in the right direction?
I would say that one of the most important things is that, you might be just working on your private. You might be a CFI who's bouncing around the pattern in the right seat of a 172. But your attitude and the way you do things matters. You're developing habits that entire time. Do the right thing. You can't say, well, this is good enough for a 172. I don't need to worry about being any better than this yet. Having good checklist discipline, sticking to your SOPs, learning your flows and your memory items, all that stuff, as well as just the attitude that you bring into the cockpit every day. All of that matters because, like I said, you're developing habits. And it'll be easier for you in the future if you do the right things right now.
I love that. Yep. Always be thinking that you're building the foundation for the future, and okay is not good enough when we're talking about something with these types of consequences, right?
Yeah. And, I'm not saying you can't have fun. Far from it. But if you're going to have fun, you still want to be safe when you're having fun. But think about the kind of fun you really want to have. There are so many things that are fun in aviation. You don't need to go and bust a whole bunch of regulations,
Yeah, right.
Let's say you think it's going to be fun to go and buzz your buddy's house. Well, a lot of people crash and die doing that. Things are very, very different when you're close to the ground. And the FAA doesn't require you to be trained on those things because they don't want you doing that stuff in the first place. So always think about what the consequences are for whatever action you happen to take, because if you're going to be doing this for a career, you can derail your career long before it ever gets started if you do the wrong things.
I love it.
Think about what you're doing. Think about, okay, if I'm going to do X, Y, or Z fun thing that I want to do, fun doesn't necessarily mean risky, but a lot of things that are fun are risky. So consider what you might not know. Consider consider what extra risks you are taking on, how to mitigate those risks. There are ways to have fun safely. So I don't want people to think I'm just a, square fly in the box kind of person all the time. I like to have fun as well, but you got to have fun the right ways to keep yourself safe, to keep yourself within the regulations, because having an accident or a violation on your record is going to make things so much more difficult for you in the future.
All right, Kent. Well, thanks for taking us through this. That was really cool to get that inside look. I want to stress ATP-CTP is not just a study course for a written exam. It's mandated training, simulator time. You're really getting into things that hopefully will save lives and hopefully have saved lives. And I agree with you. I think it can be really fun to fly precisely, develop and follow SOPs. I couldn't agree with you more. There's fun in that challenge, right? And there's also fun types of flying we can do where we can get special training. I didn't even tell you this, Kent. I just landed an airplane for the first time on water a couple of weeks ago. And awesome. So with in the right situation and with the right training, the right person there kind of guiding you, we push those corners of the envelope like we've talked about before, one corner at a time. And that's really, really fun. Lots of fun to be had without taking risks that aren't necessary. So I like that.
Yeah. If you want to turn an airplane upside down, it's a whole lot more fun if you do it in an airplane that's meant to be turned upside down. Flying an extra that's got a roll rate of 400 degrees per second and turning that upside down is going to be way more fun than trying to turn over a trainer, Cessna, or Piper. And you won't have to live with the guilt of, you performed aerobatic maneuvers in this airplane and then the wings fell off and you killed a couple people by accident.
Yep.
So, go turn an airplane upside down. Just do it at the right time and place and in the right airplane. Like I said, there's a ton of fun to be had out there. And as you just found out, the seaplanes are an awful fun as well. Yeah,
for sure. I couldn't agree more. There's consequences to everything that we're doing, and taking it seriously is important. Every pilot who goes through this ATP-CTP, and there's a lot, carries with them the learnings of thousands and thousands of people who died to give us lessons. So it's important to take it seriously. All right. So if today's episode got you thinking or got you fired up, or you've got ideas that are different from ours, or you've been through ATP-CTP yourself and you want to share your story, reach out, leave us a voicemail. As I explained on the last episode, if you go to the Contact Us page on the website, there's a new way to contact us. There's a radio check link there where you can leave up to 90 seconds, make it pithy, make it interesting, and maybe it'll end up on a future podcast. But yeah, take a look at ways to contact us there. We want to hear about it. That's one of the reasons we're here.
Now, Bill,
were you going to say something, Kent?
Last thing before we go, I think we need to leave that quote that I have highlighted right now as our parting line.
All right.
It was funny and useful, but one of the things that this retired captain said to us was, when the FAA invites you to a barbecue, you'd better be sure that you're not the pig.
I love it. All right. So that's it, everybody. I want to leave you with the fact that, physics are unforgiving. So it's best to know everything you can. So we're still flying, we're still learning, and we're trying not to be the pig. The music for today's episode is To Be an Angel by Uncle Seth. You can get more information and subscribe to the Student Pilot Cast at www.studentpilotcast.com. Remember, any instruction that you hear in this podcast was meant for the student and for the situation they were in at the time. Please do not try to blindly apply anything you see or hear in this podcast to your own flying without thinking it through on your own completely. If you have any questions about any aspect of your flying, please consult a qualified CFI.